Hello and welcome to this live webinar, an introduction to using interventions to support children and young people with SEND, Part 1, Choosing Interventions. Hopefully you heard Alison and Michael talking about how you can interact with us. We welcome questions or comments at any point, so if you think of something, type it into the question box and we'll try and respond to as many as we can at the end. I just want to mention that we do have NASEN members from all 4 nations of the UK, and we're conscious that there are differences in the systems, including in some of the terms that are used. Although other nations use additional learning needs or additional support needs, for the sake of simplicity and brevity, today we're going to use SEN and SEND. Please don't think that that excludes you, as the principles are the same whichever terms you use. These are some of the key questions that we hope to address this afternoon. How might interventions be used to support pupils with SEND, and what are the key drivers for this? And how do you find the most appropriate intervention to meet your pupils' needs? But first, let's think about what we mean by the term intervention. The word intervention can have different meanings in different contexts. In the context of this webinar today, we mean a short-term, focused teaching programme with specific intended outcomes, aimed at a particular individual or group who have needs in this area, and that this is additional to everyday teaching. We're going to talk a little more about this later on when we look at the differences between special and mainstream settings. This slide illustrates some of the issues which might inform your use of interventions, and I'm going to talk about each one of these areas in more detail over the following slides. If you have any questions or comments to make at any point, don't forget to type them into the question box on the right of your screen, and we'll aim to respond to as many as possible. The graduated approach is one of the central features of the SEND Code of Practice, and as part of the Assess strand, schools and settings will have various forms of assessment data to analyse. Don't forget that this includes qualitative as well as quantitative data. We have an upcoming series of webcasts on assessment if you want to hear more about this in depth. This will help to inform you of who needs something which is additional to and different from the usual teaching, part of the plan strand. You'll then implement whatever is needed, that's do, and review the outcomes of this. We're going to look at implementation and evaluation in future webinars. The focus today is on choosing, so we're thinking mainly about assess and plan. I also want to stress the importance of intervening early as part of a graduated approach. So make sure your provision map includes interventions which may be implemented as soon as identification of need allows. We need to try and ensure a balance between intervening early but allowing sufficient time for assessment and observation so that we're confident we're basing any intervention on solid evidence of need. Ofsted will look specifically at the progress and attainment of pupils with SEND, as well as those pupils in receipt of pupil premium, where we often see overlap with SEND. So, as high-quality teaching is the most important factor in improving outcomes for all pupils, including those with SEND, you need to be confident that this is as good as it can be in your school or setting first. However, there is an understanding from Ofsted that this teaching will not be sufficient to meet the needs of all pupils, and that the leadership should put in place measures to enable these pupils to make accelerated progress. This is where interventions may come in. In the framework it states, inspectors will consider the extent to which the school intervenes to provide support, especially for pupils at risk of underachieving. I don't want to go into funding in great depth here, and I know it's an issue in many schools currently, but don't forget that there are funding streams within school that may be used to support interventions. In England, these include the notional SEN budget, the details of which are in the public domain for maintained schools and which varies from school to school. Ask at your school if you're not sure what yours is. Pupil Premium and Pupil Premium Plus funding, which must be used to help close any gaps between disadvantaged pupils and their peers. And don't forget your staffing budget, which will include teaching assistants. You need to demonstrate that the school is getting good value for money from staffing, and effective interventions can be one way of doing this, as the Education Endowment Foundation's Teaching and Learning Toolkit evidences. By now we should all understand how important it is to use evidence-based and evidence-informed practice across education, And in no area is this more important than interventions and SEND, given the high potential for impact that interventions can make, as well as the high cost. Luckily, we now have access to lots of sources of evidence and research that can support us in our decision-making around teaching strategies and the use of interventions, including the Education Endowment Foundation's Teaching and Learning Toolkit, the Institute of Education's Maximising the Impact of Teaching Assistants work, and the SEND Gateway, which has information on research relevant to different areas of SEND. We'll talk more about the difference between evidence-based and evidence-informed practice a little later on. Research has found that there is no magic wand of intervention, and that the most important factors are to choose carefully, implement them properly, i.e. in depth and with attention to detail, and then evaluate their impact. The most successful schools use a range of interventions that focus on meeting the needs of the individual needs of their pupils, and they also give them time to embed and succeed, rather than jumping from one to another. Interventions which are evidence-based should indicate the research which has been used as their evidence, so look out for this. Are you using evidence-informed practice? Perhaps you could comment or ask a question on this. The word intervention can have different meanings depending upon the context in which it is used, and this is often the case in special schools. For example, there are many interventions to meet the needs of children and young people with autistic spectrum conditions, such as picture exchange communication system, etc. But if these are used as normal practice in your school, then they wouldn't come under the idea of intervention as we're thinking about here. Don't forget, in this context, we mean a short-term, focused teaching programme with specific intended outcomes aimed at a particular individual or group who have needs in this area, and that this is additional to everyday teaching. So this kind of intervention may still happen in a special school. For example, a reading programme over half a term for those pupils who've not made expected progress from everyday teaching. But it probably wouldn't include something like Makaton in a special school, as this would be a school-wide intervention to support communication. Let me give you an example. Aaron attends a special school and has an autistic spectrum condition. This means that visual support, structure, simplified use of language, etc. are all strategies employed all the time to support him and other children in the school. However, last term he was found to be not making the expected progress with his writing, so it was decided to implement a short-term, one-to-one writing intervention to meet his specific needs and gaps in his skills and understanding. Minecraft provided a useful vehicle for this teaching. And by the end of the term, he had made sufficient progress to no longer need an intervention in this area. Now, in a mainstream school, if a pupil needed something like Makaton, again, this would be a long-term approach to aiding their communication. But they might require a specific intervention over a short period to introduce them to particular signs that they'll need for this term's topic. For example, Sarah has Down syndrome and is in a mainstream primary. She uses Makaton to support her communication, as do the staff and many of her friends. When the class is going to do a new topic, say on the Victorians, a TA does a pre-teach intervention to introduce the relevant signs to Sarah so that she can access the class teaching more easily. So really the difference could be summarised as to whether something is a long-term strategy or a short-term intervention. I mentioned the importance of early intervention on a previous slide, and I want to emphasise that again here. It's possible that some pupils may have been inappropriately identified with SEND because the appropriate provision wasn't put in place early enough to address the gaps in their learning or understanding. This particularly applies in areas like speech and language. So let me tell you about Sam. Sam's in Year 5. He has reading comprehension difficulties and is having a lot of support both in class and through interventions. He's also demonstrating some challenging behaviours. When he was assessed by the SEN consultant, he was found to have significant difficulties with language comprehension, and on talking to his early years teacher, it was found that when he started in reception, he barely spoke. So, Sam is now identified as having special educational needs in literacy, whereas some intensive intervention in reception may have enabled him to develop his early language skills, which may have helped his literacy development. So it's really important that we use whatever data we have available to be proactive and put intervention in place as soon as a need arises or looks as if it might arise. But don't feel that you can't intervene because an earlier need was not identified. Early also means intervening as soon as you realise there's a concern. So in a secondary school, early intervention would probably be in year 7. It's always better to intervene at the point at which you feel it's needed, even if you think it would have been preferable if the intervention had taken place 5 years ago. We can only meet the needs as they present to us at the time. What kind of data would help us here? Some things are obvious. Attainment data, such as progress against age-related expectations, the Year 1 phonics check, etc. You'll be able to identify those pupils who are falling behind or at risk of falling behind, as well as monitoring the attainment of your pupils with identified SEND. You may have data from specialist teachers who've assessed your pupil with SEND. Make sure you use it, as it should be the most relevant for that pupil. But data in other areas like behaviour is also important. If a pupil keeps receiving sanctions, perhaps this is due to an unmet SEND, and they may benefit from changes to teaching strategies and possibly an intervention. Are they presenting with challenging behaviour because of difficulties with literacy or numeracy? Do they need a social skills intervention or an anger management intervention? I know, for example, of some very successful interventions that focus on developing turn-taking and interaction skills by setting up small groups of pupils for designing and building models. The pupils focus on their task within the group as part of an activity that they enjoy, whilst developing their social and language skills at the same time. Their data would mainly be based on observation by the staff against specific social skills targets that had been set for them. And don't forget qualitative data. This is sometimes called soft data, but is just as valuable as the quantitative data that you have. Is there one pupil that the staff keep talking to you about, or whose name you keep hearing in the staff room? Is this a child with SEND? Might an intervention help to resolve an issue before it becomes too big? In these circumstances, you might need to do some further investigation before deciding on a course of action, but don't ignore this sort of soft data. It can be just as important as the numbers on the tracking sheet. And remember that information from parents and carers and the pupils themselves can be invaluable as part of your data collection. Knowing how children and young people behave in different contexts can make a real difference to how you respond to them, and parents should be able to give you a lot of information around this. As I referred to on the previous slide, there are various ways in which interventions might support pupils with SEND, and you need to match the intervention to the need that you've identified using your data. For example, an issue with reading probably requires an intervention that addresses reading. I say probably because it may be a speech and language issue. Try and find out. However, there are many reading interventions out there, and they don't all do the same thing. For example, a child who's having difficulties decoding words probably needs a phonics-based intervention, whereas a child who decodes accurately but doesn't understand what they read needs something quite different. A similar situation would apply with maths. Some pupils may have a particular difficulty with one concept, say fractions, and need some extra teaching on that, probably haven't got SEND, whereas other pupils, for example, can't visualise 3D shape, which is a common difficulty with people on the autistic spectrum. And this is likely to be a longer-term issue, which may also impact in other areas. But interventions are not just for the core subjects. They can be just as effective for social skills, behaviour management, other subject areas such as science and so on. As with all interventions, the key will be transferring what is learned back into the classroom or the wider environment. And we'll talk about this more when we look at implementation. Aim to match the intervention to the pupil, rather than putting a pupil in an intervention because that's the one you use in Year 3. There's nothing worse than trying to get that square peg to fit the round hole of an intervention. The most important thing for now is to ensure that the intervention you choose has the potential to meet the need which you've identified and deliver on the outcomes that you've agreed. I know of one school where all pupils identified as not making progress were put into a phonics intervention because that was the intervention that they had, regardless of the fact that only a small number of them had a need in phonics. Just think about what this cost in terms of staffing and resourcing, and for the pupils themselves who were being taken out of other lessons to attend these intervention sessions, which was still not addressing their needs. We need to be really clear that participating in an intervention is more effective for that child than staying in their classroom would be, as they are likely to be missing out on some teaching whilst they're receiving the intervention. There are no guarantees, but matching the intervention to the child rather than the other way round is a good place to start. Talk to the child where appropriate, and their parents or carers, to gather their views and use these. Interventions are always more effective when everyone's on board. In some areas, it is relatively easy to source a published intervention which will address the needs you've identified. This is particularly the case for primary age English and to a lesser extent maths interventions. However, bear in mind that just because an intervention has been published does not mean that it is necessarily evidence-based, which is what we'd be looking for here. A reliable resource for literacy interventions is What Works for Children and Young People with Literacy Difficulties by Greg Brooks, which is a meta-analysis of literacy interventions for pupils with and without SEND, which measures the relative impact and cost of these over time. It's a very useful document. With all published interventions, check carefully the age range that it's aimed at, as well as the level of need that it's addressing. There's no point, for example, implementing a phonics intervention aimed at letters and sounds phase 5 if your pupil is still struggling in letters and sounds phase 2. You also need to consider whether any training is required for the staff who will be implementing it. This is almost always the case with published interventions, and in some cases the training is quite extensive, which of course is one of the reasons why they're effective. If you're not in a position to offer this training, then there would be little point in running the intervention, as you would not be able to expect the outcomes that you need. It's often worth seeing if you can work collaboratively with another school to share the costs of training. This can also set you up with a really useful network of practitioners who can work together to develop their practice too. Consider what the requirements of the intervention are in terms of regularity and frequency of sessions, the number of weeks it should be run for, group size, resources needed, and so on. And remember, those schools who are most successful often do fewer interventions, but they do them properly. In other words, they're resourced at the level recommended by the publisher and on which the evidence that you're referencing is based. Now I want to tell you about Danielle, to illustrate how important it is to ensure integrity to whichever published intervention you're using. Remember, you can only say that you're using an evidence-based intervention if you follow the conditions upon which the evidence was based. Danielle was in Year 6. She couldn't read a single word and had no phonic knowledge. Her school decided to implement a published intervention that addressed both phonics and whole words, and asked a specialist to come in to train the staff on how to use it. So far, so good. So the staff were trained according to the instructions and implemented the intervention for the requisite 6 weeks. However, the TA delivering the intervention felt that it wasn't engaging enough and decided to do it differently to make it more interesting for Danielle. At the end of the 6 weeks, Danielle had made no progress, and the staff were going to give up on the intervention as it seemed not to work. Following further discussion with the specialist, the changes that had been made came to light. Staff were retrained, and it was emphasised that they must not make any changes from the published instructions. So the intervention was implemented for 4 more weeks exactly as recommended by the publishers, and after 4 weeks Danielle was flying. She could now read a growing bank of words and was beginning to use her developing phonics skills to word build. She was beginning to read at last. This example illustrates that it's essential to follow the instructions in a published intervention, or you can't say that you're using evidence-based practice. Bear this in mind when you're choosing which intervention to use, as if you know you won't be able to do this, say the intervention ought to take place 3 times a week, but you can only manage to do it once, then there may not be much point doing it at all, as you won't be able to achieve the progress that the intervention claims. The May 2017 edition of NAESON Connect features an article talking about how one primary school has used interventions effectively, so look out for that in May. For some of your pupils' needs, though, you won't be able to find a published intervention that does exactly what you want it to. This is particularly an issue with older pupils and pupils with less prevalent types of SEND. Or it may be that you realise you have the skills in school to meet this need without having to use a published intervention. In these cases, you may decide to design a bespoke intervention, and this is where you'd need to ensure that your intervention is evidence-informed. I'm going to go through some of the principles that evidence-informed interventions would follow, and we've taken this from the Maximising the Impact of Teaching Assistants research. Effective interventions happen at least twice a week. Doing something once a week rarely has as great an impact, and usually over a period of between 6 and 20 weeks. Any less and the intervention may not have time to work. Any longer, and it might be that this is not the right intervention for this pupil at this time. Each session should usually last for between 10 and 30 minutes, although of course this does depend upon the age and abilities of the pupil. Most effective interventions follow a fast pace in each session, so every minute is used to its full effect. Training is crucial. The staff delivering the intervention need to know not just what the activities are, but why and how they're going to be doing them. And this is likely to be informal training with a bespoke intervention, which may just involve the person who's designed it talking it through with the staff who are going to deliver it. And this links to planning. Sessions need to be well planned. This doesn't necessarily mean writing plans in great detail, but knowing exactly what you want to achieve in a session and how you hope to achieve it. Assessment for learning strategies will be needed here. For any intervention to be effective, it's crucial that the learning that happens goes back into the classroom. So make sure that you build in mechanisms for this, such as making it explicit to the pupils themselves. For example, in a reading intervention, you might say, don't forget next time you're reading in class, try to remember what we're learning and use that to help you. As well as giving some time for the staff involved to be able to speak to each other about those links. Assessment of some kind on entry and exit will be essential in order to know whether the intervention has had impact. Look out for our upcoming NASON webcasts on assessment too. And this last one seems to be quite a minor point, but it's extremely difficult to implement an intervention effectively in a corridor or the back of a noisy classroom, especially if it relies on the children listening, which it usually does. Make sure there's an appropriate space which will be available at the specified times. If you've only got 30 minutes, you don't want to spend 15 of those looking for somewhere to deliver your intervention. The content of your intervention could be whatever you've determined is needed by the pupil or group of pupils. But as long as you follow these principles, you can say that you're using evidence-informed practice, and you should see impact for those pupils in the area targeted. So, to summarise, know your pupils. Use quantitative and qualitative data to get to know their needs. Know your staff. What are their strengths? What skills do they have? What training have they had? Try and have a wide range of interventions available so that you can choose the best one for each pupil and don't have to try and squeeze the pupil into the intervention. And finally, be prepared to be flexible and respond to individual need. Be prepared to design a bespoke intervention if necessary.